The Holcim Foundation Awards is proud to partner with The Urbanist on Monocle Radio. The Holcim Foundation Awards is the world's premier competition for sustainable design, highlighting projects that contribute to the transformation of the building sector. Awarding $1 million in prizes, it honours excellence in sustainable design and construction. By showcasing innovative, soon-to-be-realised projects, the awards drive change and inspire a new generation to adopt responsible design practices. Entry for the next awards competition is open now. Find out more, get involved and submit your free entry. Go to holcimfoundation.org/awards. The Holcim Foundation Awards, proud partner of The Urbanist on Monocle Radio.
Hello and welcome to The Urbanist, Monocle's programme all about the built environment. I'm your host, Andrew Tuck. Coming up.
Interior decoration and design really is an art form, but it's also a very fragile and fugitive one.
We explore some iconic parts of London's past, both interior and exterior, their risk being lost to time or forgotten about entirely. Firstly, we open a book revealing the historic interiors of the UK capital through a curated collection of archive photography. Then we look at a shining example of brutalist architecture in the city and what has been done to ensure it is preserved for future generations. That's all coming up over the next 30 minutes, right here on The Urbanist with me, Andrew Tuck. Okay, we're going to start today with a look back in time inside some of London's finest interiors that may have otherwise not been accessible to the general public. Historian Stephen Brindle has recently released a book titled London Lost Interiors, which explores the history of design in the UK capital between 1880 and 1950. 650 black and white archive photographs give readers a window into a lost world, revealing changing tastes in fashion, art and design from the Victorian age to the post-war years of austerity. And I'm happy to say that I'm joined now by Stephen here in the studio. Stephen, thank you so much for being here. Now, tell us first of all how you put this together. There's an archive of all these amazing images, isn't there?
Well, the archive belongs to Historic England, used to be half of English heritage before it divided, and before that it was called the National Monument Record. And it's a vast, vast archive of something like 8 or 9 million images, but among them there are whole individual collections, and there are two important collections within that of photographers, photographic firms, one called Bedford Lemire and Company, who worked in London from about 1860 to 1940, and one called Miller and Harris, who worked in London from about 1930 up to 1980. And so most of the images are from those two archives. And as to how it was put together, well, you don't do something like this quickly, and the book evolved over about 10 years.
Your task, then, you see this vast archive. Now, you put the book obviously into chapters. You look at the plutocrats, the middle classes, the aristocrats. Were you aware as you began to traverse all these incredible images how you would divide it up and put a book together from it?
Yes, absolutely. First, there would have to be a chronological element, and in this, the First World War forms the great watershed, and there really is before the war and after the war, and there's a major difference between the two. And before the war, it's mostly Bedford Lemire, and after the war, there's some Bedford Lemire, but then it's mostly Miller and Harris. So they look different because Miller and Harris were a different firm using a different kind of photographic technique by then, and photographing mostly by artificial light, so the photographs look and feel different. But it was also apparent that there would have to be a primarily thematic element to this. You can't say they span the whole range of society because poor people did not have their environments photographed unless it was by London County Council documenting what appalling conditions people lived in that they were about to demolish. And in the very first draft, I did have a chapter called Working Lives, but there weren't very many. And it didn't really hang together very well because about half of them were doss houses, literally, because that's what got photographed in terms of poor people's environments. Photographs of poor people's homes before the Second World War are as rare as hen's teeth, and we just ultimately didn't feel that it made sense as a chapter. There weren't enough, and you couldn't honestly say this is how working class people lived, so that got dropped. I was a little sad about that because it took something off the comprehensiveness, but the comprehensiveness just wasn't possible. So yes, it's a thematic coverage, and there is a chapter dedicated to the middle classes, but some are more stylistic. So there's one that's called From the Arts and Crafts to the Aesthetic Movement, for example. So it had to be a blend of chronological, but mostly about that, before the First World War and after it, and thematic.
Stephen, tell me, what were the causes of these interiors being lost? Is it changing tastes? Is it the wealth subsided for many of these families? What did asunder for some of these great interiors that we see in the book?
Gosh, social change, London's continuing prosperity, the tremendous churn of economic activity in a city that is as economically vibrant and active as London, so that the great aristocratic townhouses, which represented the peak of architecture and domestic sort of interior design in London, were becoming outmoded, out of date, and also unfeasibly expensive after the Great War, and they just started to be demolished. So about half of all the buildings in the book have been demolished, and even where the buildings survive, because the book is entirely about domestic interiors, of course, they've been converted to hotels or offices or institutional uses, and the interiors are stripped out. And in many cases, it's the contents that really constitute what's special about the interior, and they've been dispersed anyway. So one of the things which really impressed itself on me while doing this is that interior decoration and design really is an art form, but it's also a very fragile and fugitive one.
You talk about the Grosvenor House and the Dorchester. So these were both sites of grand family houses, which they get turned into hotels. They lose their kind of function as a home, the city home of wealthy families.
Yes, they were particularly magnificent houses, Dorchester House and Grosvenor House, on Park Lane. And even the Dukes of Westminster, who actually owned Mayfair and Belgravia, by the 30s could no longer justify the cost of running Grosvenor House. The people who actually owned the ground rents could no longer sustain this, and Bendall, the third Duke of Westminster, had it demolished. It's partly that it would have just seemed absolutely out of another age. It would have seemed like a dinosaur, but built partly as an art gallery to house a great art collection. Both of those houses were.
Well, in some of the notes I got to see before we met, there's one Hyde Park Gardens, which you will remember with the tigers on the ground. And there's the whiff of the colonies and the empire still in these interiors.
More than a whiff, yes, absolutely. There was a strong sense of London, not just as an imperial capital, but as a very cosmopolitan city. And one thing that impresses itself on you as you go through chapters is that while royalty and aristocracy, chapter 1, is mostly about the traditional British aristocratic ruling class, chapter 2, which is called the plutocrats, probably a majority of the plutocrats in question were born outside the United Kingdom. So there's cosmopolitanness in the international rich settling in London, really for the first time, that thing which has been a phenomenon up to our own age. And then there's a whole theme of what you might call orientalising interiors, which take various forms. They could be Middle Eastern or Indian or Chinese or Japanese in style. And there were wonderful examples of all those, and virtually all of them have gone. There is a single surviving example in London, and that's the Arab Hall at Leighton House Museum, which we now view as a sort of beautiful one-off, made by Sir Frederick Leighton, the great artist, the president of the Royal Academy. But actually, that was just a particularly fine example of what was quite a common genre. There would have been dozens and dozens of these things across London, and there are pictures of quite a few in the book, and we chose one as our cover image. There's this marvellous sort of Middle Eastern tent room, which was actually made by a retired soldier in an ordinary terrace house in Westminster.
Now, while many of those early, especially the Victorian interiors, are a world of swags and drapes and gilt, what also struck me is, that this is also the birth of modern design in many ways. The Art Deco interiors, for example, so clean and so stripped back, a version of minimalism almost in the way that they came back to the purity of line and design. Is there a story for us to find there for modern times as well, if we look back at these for inspiration?
I think there's inspiration of many kinds here, Andrew. I think in hindsight, the 1920s and 30s can be seen as the real belle époque, the high watermark of interior design as an art form. Because although we, in hindsight, view it as being about Art Deco and the modern movement, which it certainly was, it's all the birth of those great movements in design, there were also lots of other things going on. There were still wonderful, more traditional neo-Georgian and classically styled interiors being created, and there were variants, creative variants on historic styles, which being given names like Vogue Regency or Curzon Street Baroque, which are different ways of combining historic elements, which were less literally revivalist than the Victorians might have been, and depended on mixing elements perhaps from different cultures and different ages sometimes, or reinterpreting them in a more streamlined contemporary way. And so Vogue Regency interiors are a sort of blend of art and Art Deco streamlined aesthetic with Regency furniture and Regency features, which works really well. So there's a great stylistic range going on, and there are still like post-arts and crafts interiors being created. It was an era of immense creativity in architecture and in interior design, and much of that was due to women as both designers and the clients. And this is quite hard to see now because most of the interiors have gone.
One of them, which I have here, is 95 Arlington House. And again, what's also interesting when you talked earlier on about how the empire and trade influenced some of those houses in the 1880s and 90s, by the time you get to the 20s and 30s, you're beginning to see perhaps cinematic influences. When I looked at these, they could be sets for a great, smart movie from the times. Do you think they were pulling from Hollywood and from the world of international glamour by this stage?
Yes, I'm quite sure they were. One of the sets of photographs I was most pleased to find was Fay Ray's apartment on an apartment building in Grosvenor Square, and she lives in a rather fabulous deco modern apartment with sort of mirrored furniture and things and wrought iron gates to the dining room and that kind of thing. Yes, I'm sure that Hollywood was helping to reinforce a new image of sort of deco modernity and a streamlined aesthetic. The one you refer to, Mr. Stevenson's flat in Arlington House, has furniture probably designed by a man called Alistair Maynard, a wonderfully talented deco designer, and those photographs were themselves used to market a design company called Reams Arter, and I know because I've seen issues of Vogue magazine, and there are the same pictures advertising Reams Arter, so it seems quite likely that that apartment was designed as a sort of show flat for Reams Arter. So there's a collaboration there between them and Alistair Maynard, a very brilliant furniture designer, and there is a sort of strongly ocean liner deco aesthetic going on there, yes. It could almost be from the 60s as easily as the 30s.
Now, we see the influence of the big home designers, the likes of Sybil Colfax. There are interiors by Lutyens, by Paul Nash, by Eric Gill. But maybe we could just finally talk about this one by Paul Nash. There's an amazing picture of a bathroom he designed for Wimpole Street. It's 1931. And he's using things that we probably don't realise people use back then. Fluorescent lighting, mirrored walls and ceilings. He went to town.
It's an extraordinary thing, isn't it? This was for Edward James, well-known heir to a great fortune, owner of the Westdean estate, owner of a great estate in Mexico, who married a ballet dancer called Tilly Losh. And he had this bathroom created for her in a house in Harley Street, which still stands. I think it's now a doctor's surgery. And the great surprise is the designer should be Paul Nash, who we think of as being this sort of neo-romantic landscape painter who painted wonderful sort of expressive English landscape, but also the tragic landscapes, the landscape of the First World War in France. But that Paul Nash should have designed this extraordinary thing, which is a bit like a cubist painting or like a Mondrian painting turned into a room, really, is a wonderful surprise. And it is one of many rooms which you can see is conceived as a work of art, a space that is a carefully considered work of art by a very major artist, but very surprising that that artist, you'd think it would be a cubist painter, and it turns out to be Paul Nash.
Just finally, Tommy, is there anything that you think we should do in the future to preserve interiors? Because they always seem a little bit sad even when they're taken by great museums and dissembled from the place where they were meant to be. You get to see some of the kind of essence of them, but it's the people that made them such great places.
I think one has to acknowledge to an extent that interiors are the expression of their cultures and specifically of their owners, and that they are likely to be mortal. And I think that's one of the great things the book tells us, that the interiors, that they are lost, shows that the interiors are as mortal as their creators. And if there's something tragic, then that's sort of part of the human condition, and you can't keep everything. Another thing which tells us is that there are hundreds and thousands of perhaps comparably fine interiors which weren't recorded and which truly are lost to us. And I think that there's a certain tragic sense about that. I think I would say that I think there is value in trying to preserve one or two, and I'd applaud the efforts of museums and curators just to recreate or to preserve just one or two, because I think interior design deserves to be acknowledged more as the art form it undoubtedly is. One I particularly liked recently was the Hugh Lane Gallery's moving and recreation of Francis Bacon's studio in their gallery in Dublin. I think that's really a fantastic thing to do.
Stephen Brindle, thank you very much for joining me. And Stephen's new book, London Lost Interiors, is out now via Atlantic Publishing. Space House is an icon of brutalist architecture in London that was designed by Richard Seifert in the 1960s. But like many examples of British brutalism, its modern life hasn't always been certain. When the developer Seaforth Land acquired the building in 2016, it was in need of a lot of TLC, and in the past, it might have been destined for demolition. Instead, Seaforth Land and architect Squire and Partners have undertaken an ambitious restoration process to give this piece of London history a brighter outlook. Recently, Monocle's Carlotta Ribello caught up with Tyler Goodwin from Seaforth Land and Tim Gledstone from Squire and Partners to discuss how they've brought this 60s icon into a sustainable future. Carlotta began by asking Tyler to give us a background on Space House.
So Space House was, you can talk a little bit more, Tim, about the architectural heritage of the building, but a 1960s designed, built in 1968, mid-century modern brutalist period building. We developed it to additional almost 40,000 square feet on top of the building, but also some infill. These buildings are rapidly disappearing, so these mid-century buildings really do need to be saved. And so we fortunately found a partner with Quadrille, a Canadian pension fund, to support us in our plan to bring this building back to a prime grade A first-class building.
And Tim, let's describe the building for our listeners and exactly why, when it was built and after all these years, it remains such an icon.
Yeah, it's a very interesting building because it's at a really interesting juncture of districts, some more famous than others, but actually all of international kind of status, where we are just north of the Thames. We sit in Covent Garden on a grand road that was once envisaged to be like the London Champs-Élysées, called Kingsway. It also is opposite the LSE building and Lincoln's Inn and the home of law around the world. And so it's a very interesting location. Its form actually is incredibly polite on Kingsway. Its silhouette is no different to what was known at the time as the bowler hat buildings, which we all love today. These sort of Victorian, late Edwardian, very smart buildings like the BBC buildings that sat on the Strand as well, just to our south. Very elegant buildings, but a simple parapet height. So what we call the block, which is on Kingsway, simply follows this parapet, but with a very subtle mid-century feeling to it. Particularly as we found the building, we've reinforced this. But behind, where the building becomes exceptionally unusual, the block building is only about 15 metres deep. At that time, perfect for cross-ventilation, beautiful daylight. Unusually, the cores put at each end, so you've got transparency through the building, which we really appreciate today. But behind, the road network is less organised, and we're at a junction of about 4 roads that creates a little place in the middle of Covent Garden. And to mark this place, the original building rose up way above the parapet of all the surrounding heritage rooftops. We kind of left Mary Poppins world behind, and it rises up 3 times the height of the conservation area. So it has pretty unparalleled views for its location and forevermore, really, because the conservation's there. So you've got this contrast between a little polite block and this rising rotunda tower, which is the form that the building took, not giving any hierarchy to any direction, in fact, looking 360, with an expressed skeletal, crafted, sculptural, brutalist response.
What was the biggest needs that were identified when the project first started, that you knew, okay, these are the priorities and what we need to address head on to bring this building into the future?
I'll start with that one because I think probably it's slightly technical, and I appreciate all the listeners understand everything there is to know about the mechanics of running a building. But the building was originally designed to be completely naturally ventilated. This is a good thing, a very good thing. And if you can tolerate it, it actually is certainly the future. But we live in a world where it does get a little bit hot and it does get a little bit cold. So how do we heat? How do we cool in those periods of time? And ideally, we only choose the times that we need to do it, not just run the building like a fridge or a heater the whole time. This is the first starting point in all good design ethics today. What Space House struggled with, like many of the buildings of this period, when they were designed to be completely passive, and you live with a hot day, you live with a cold day, it didn't do that. And the occupiers start adding layers and layers and layers, ducts where they shouldn't go. In the case of Space House, it ended up with something like 2.5 floors of telephone masts, chiller units. It's already 3 times the height of the conservation area, so I enjoy it today as I walk across Waterloo Bridge. But 4 years ago, when we walked across Waterloo Bridge, it's a disaster, and you can see it from everywhere. It's caravans and it's a dumping ground of outdated, gas-guzzling mechanical equipment and telephone masts on top. So that is the number one challenge. We have to integrate it, but our skills as designers and clients, and skills that we're hoping to share with the occupants, is to minimise the amount we use. And good design, including the original building, can help be more sensitive and more aware of how much energy we're using and when we need to use it.
And that integration plan, here you were talking about the building itself, but right before we came on there, we were talking about public realm. And that is an aspect that is ever more important. And there's been a lot of progress over the last decade in prioritising what happens at ground level. Tyler, tell us a bit more about what's happening here at Space House.
Yeah, and I completely agree with Tim. I mean, the mechanical electrical solution that we came up with, that was number one. The number two was really public realm intervention. And this is where the direction of the original architect, if you go back to these renderings in 1960, it was the romantic era of the car. And, you know, there were 3 car ramps going down to 222 car parking stalls on site. And it was car parking, and there was a little filling station for petrol. And that was romantic. And oh, amazing. You could pull your car up to the front.
Like the Jetsons.
Yes. And today, of course, it's like people aren't driving cars. I think in Camden, I saw a recent stat, 67% of residents in Camden don't have cars. They're not driving cars. And so our building is now 4 on-site car parking at ground level. That's it, from 222 to 4. All of the underground, the end of journey experience, we preserved one of the ramps, the original sculptured ramp that goes down. So you have this cycle-centered journey, end of journey experience for 64 showers plus 610 bike parking stalls. At the ground floor, that's now committed to F&B, treed outside seating. We've got 4 food truck locations with water and power, and we've been able to reintroduce the original intent of the architect. It was originally called Space House. We didn't give it that name. And the architecture at this ground floor, these beautiful pilasters and Y-shaped columns that are elevated to make the building look like they float. Here, I'm raising my hands like they can see this. But if you came on site, you could see that the buildings, as you walk on the pedestrian side, these buildings do look like they float. And now you can see through the block into the public realm. And we're reintroducing the original intent of the architects, making it truly a public realm space.
Well, I'm curious, Tim, on that point, how important is it when tackling heritage preservation and rebuilding efforts to preserve the vision of the original architect? I'm curious about, the duality there, because in a way you want to honor the original work, but sometimes that doesn't marry up with where the industry is today. So how do you tackle that?
In our case, the evidence of what you find in the building is your first starting point. But often we found that pieces were missing and had gone. The as-built drawings we could find. We worked with the original engineers, so that's a great starting point. We're building on that legacy of Pell Frischmann. The as-built drawings, though, through consultation, we found out in some cases it wasn't built that way. It was changed on site. And in this case, we're relying on some public consultation we did And we were gifted some photographs by a gentleman that came into the consultation saying they were his father's own architectural photographs he had taken, because he went to the same architecture school as George Marsh, who was the Seafoot's right-hand man, and he'd taken these pictures proudly of his friend's work and then donated them to us, and we could follow that vision. Other elements, Seafoot always used this amazing artist who produced these beautiful watercolours and sketches of the vision. Now, we know as an architect today, sometimes the visions, they can become a bit compromised for one reason or another. I think a mezzanine floor was put in between the ground and first floor, but the rendering showed this extra high double height space. The silhouette was always super clean, but at that time Camden said, look, Mr. Seafoot, Mr. Hyams, I think it's high enough. I think you should stop there. So the vision was always bolder, and we can emphasise that, and we worked with Historic England and Camden to say we can make the original vision stronger, the intent stronger, one, to deal with the machinery on top, but let us do that and be more generous. Then we can free up the ground floor and deliver that vision. And it's these little ideas as you move around. There's a beautiful concrete soffits to every single floor plate, but they were always covered up. The architect probably dreamt of them being exposed, but the reality of how do you do lights and details into them was never resolved. Today, we can use today's technology to really help us map all that out, use the latest technology to completely predict where every little pipe and buckle and strap will go, and thread. What we've done is thread in every single coffer the perfect locations. So we've got exposed ceilings, new services, but new services bespokely woven into the fabric of the existing building. So we are certainly honouring the intent with even greater confidence, building upon the confidence of the 1960s.
The work that has been done here, can it serve as a blueprint for other developers, other architects? Is that your hopes for the building, that it can serve as a blueprint for your peers?
First, I want to call out Tim, because I think it's important that we don't say, okay, there's a cookie cutter approach, because that's never the case with refurbishment. Every building has its unique challenges and its unique opportunity. And I think it takes a willingness to embrace that archaeology and to search for the objet trouvé. And if you go to Tim's headquarters, the Squire department store in Brixton, that is a case study for Space House. It's quite daring to say those scars and those details, they might not be perfect, but they're authentic. And finding the authenticity in a building, the story and the narrative, and finding opportunities to celebrate it while respecting the need for modern and new, and really doing that through juxtaposition. So that's, really a credit to Tim and his team, that if you want to do something like this, you need to find the right partners that have a vision for celebrating what's there and have the patience. And then you need partners that are willing to have that patient process, because it's not like building a new building, which you knock down a site, you design the building. I have nothing against building new buildings in the right context, but then the contractor goes on and does it. And that doesn't happen in a refurb. You are on site every day as layers are getting removed, saying, stop, don't do that. Oh no, let's celebrate this, cover this up. How are we going to solve this?
I think each of the cases can become a very good case study. And in the case study, others can come and visit and explore and understand the challenges that we faced and how we resolved that. And part of the community where this building sits as a community of brutalist buildings and sits in a community of its period. And there are the supporters of such buildings. And they, actually Tyler and Seaforth and ourselves, have not shied away from those communities. At the 20th Century Society, we embraced right from the beginning London Modern. We have hosted of events. We've talked and walked people through this building, shared the process. And this is a really valuable thing to do as well, not to be shy or scared or protective, to talk about the problems. And where I'm really quite excited is that we're now finding new friends. So there's the Commonwealth Mid-Century Forum, and in that, London and ourselves can really help all around the world. That's an immediate starting point with this little club of how to tackle these problems and overcome the vanillaization of office buildings, which is a terrible office building in the first place. So celebrate your differences, which I think applies to lots of things in life.
One of the other challenges that I think is really important for the built environment generally and the market is this challenge of sustainability. And, when we started on Space House, we were told there's no way it could be BREEAM Outstanding. For years, we were told it's never been done to make a listed building, and especially a big brutalist listed building, into BREEAM Outstanding. We're achieving that. It's a net zero building. We were told that couldn't be done either. We're Neighbors 4.5 star. Neighbors is that measure for operational carbon. I think we can, with partnership with the tenants and through this innovative BIM system that we have, where the windows, we can remotely open them through an algorithm and thermally load the structure overnight, I think we can get to 6-star Neighbors, which is, again, unheard of. So my message to the market is, whatever people say can't be done, I think there are so many great experts out there, and the expertise is really growing quickly to solve problems and come up with better solutions. So unlocking these sustainability challenges with these older buildings is really critical.
Tyler Goodwin and Tim Gledstone there, speaking with Carlotta Rebello. And that's all for this week's episode of The Urbanist. Remember, you can get new editions of the show every week. Just follow us through your favourite podcast provider. You can also subscribe to Monocle magazine for regular reports on all things design, architecture and urbanism. Just visit monocle.com. This episode of The Urbanist was produced by Carlotta Rebello and by David Stevens, who also edits the show. I'm Andrew Tuck. Goodbye, and thank you for listening, City Lovers.